"Save my sister, and I'll give you strong sons," said the 18-year-old girl to the mountain man. Snow was falling hard that day, the kind that swallows sound and buries tracks. Bow in hand, her voice shaking but her eyes unbroken. Her sister was gone, taken by men who don't care about law, land, or life. The mountain man thought it was just a rescue. But out here, nothing's ever that simple. Behind the abduction lies a piece of ground worth more than gold, a sacred spring. The company men will burn a camp to get. They'll have to cross blizzards, dodge rifle fire, and face the marshal who says the paper in his saddlebag makes it. All legal, but when the fire's burning low and the hoofbeats are coming fast, the real question ain't just who'll survive. It's this: will he save her sister? And in doing so, choose the family he never thought he'd have. Every story brings us a little closer together. Before we dive in, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from. It's a joy to see how far this family of listeners reaches. The bitter wind howled outside Elias Keene's cabin as he stirred the pot of venison, stew hanging over the fireplace, dark eyes following his every move. The lamplight cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, and the smell of sage and pine smoke filled the small space. Nalen's breathing had steadied since he'd brought her in from the storm, but her words still echoed in his mind. The offer of sons, it wasn't the kind of proposition a man like him ever expected to hear, especially not from a young Apache woman barely into womanhood. He'd been alone in these mountains since Sarah died 5 years ago, and he'd meant to keep it that way here. He filled a tin cup with stew and handed it to her. "Get some warmth in you." Her fingers trembled slightly as she took the cup, but her gaze remained steady. "Much obliged," she said in careful English. Steam rose from the cup as she sipped slowly, color returning to her wind-chapped cheeks. Elias settled onto his 3-legged stool, studying her. Despite her exhaustion, she held herself with dignity. Her clothes, though frozen stiff earlier, were well-made, leather-decorated with intricate beadwork. Not a runaway, then. Something worse had driven her into the storm. "Your sister," he said quietly. "Tell me what happened." Nalen set down her cup, her face hardening. "For 8 days ago, freight wagon crew passing near our winter camp. My sister, Kaya, she was gathering pine nuts," her voice caught. "They took her. Said they'd sell her in the mining camps." Elisa's jaw tightened. He'd seen such things before, during his Army Scout days. Young Native women disappearing into the camps, never to be seen again. "How many men?" "4. 2 wagons." Nalen's fingers traced the bow lying across her lap. "I followed their trail until the storm came, lost it in the snow." Her eyes met his, fierce despite her fatigue. "You know these mountains. You were Army Scout. I saw your jacket hanging there. Help me find her, and I will keep my word." "That's not why I'd help," Elias said gruffly. The very thought of accepting such a bargain made his stomach turn. "But those camps? They're no place for a young girl." "Then you will help." Hope flickered across her face. Elias stood and walked to the window. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes swirling in the darkness. Any tracks would be covered by morning, but he knew where those freight wagons were headed. Only one pass was still open this late in winter. "We'll need supplies," he said finally, "and better weather than this." He turned back to her. "But understand something. I'm helping because it's right, not because of any bargain." Nalen straightened, pride and desperation warring in her expression. "I had a wife once," Elias said quietly. "Sarah fever took her 5 winters ago. Haven't wanted another since." He moved to add wood to the fire, avoiding Nalen's gaze. "There's a pallet in the corner. Get some rest. We'll need it." But Nalen wasn't finished. "My grandfather is medicine man. He taught me many things, how to heal, how to track. I would be good wife. Don't go trading it away so quick." He picked up his rifle and began cleaning it, trying to ignore the way her words stirred something deep inside him, not desire, but a long-buried ache of loneliness, he'd thought, frozen solid as the winter ground. "My sister is 16, Nalen said softly. "She is all I have left. Our parents died of smallpox when we were small." The thought of her in those camps, she shuddered. Elias's hands stilled on the rifle. He remembered other young women he'd failed to save back in his Army days. The helplessness he'd felt watching treaties broken, promises turned to dust. But this time was different. This time he could act. "First light," he said. "We'll head out first light. if the storms passed. He glanced at her bow. You any good with that? Might need it. He stood and reached for his coat. I'm going to check the animals, make sure they're sheltered good. Try to sleep some. As he turned toward the door, her voice stopped him. Why do you live alone up here, so far from others? Elias paused, his hand on the latch. Reckon some men aren't meant for company, he said finally. But even as he spoke the words, he wondered if they were still true. The cabin had never felt quite so empty as it had these past years. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside his mind, something else stirred a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since leaving the army. Tomorrow they'd begin tracking Nalan's sister. Tonight, he had preparations to make and memories to wrestle with in the darkness. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in pale gold, but the wind still howled like a hungry wolf around the cabin's corners. Inside, Elias stirred the morning fire, while Nalan sat cross-legged at his rough-hewn table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The aroma of fresh cornbread filled the small space. Tell me more about these men, Elias said, setting a plate of golden cornbread before her. His voice was gentle, but his eyes were sharp as arrowheads. Nalan broke off a piece of bread, considering her words carefully. They wore mining company clothes, Garvey Mining Company patches on their coats. She spoke the name with clear distaste. 4 men, 2 wagons. Their leader had a scar here. She traced a line across her left cheek. When exactly did they take your sister? 2 days ago. Ayoka was gathering pine nuts near the edge of our winter camp. Nalan's fingers tightened around her cup. I heard her scream. By the time I reached the spot, they were already loading her into a wagon. Elias nodded slowly, piecing together the timing. And you tracked them until the storm caught you. She gestured to the window, where fat flakes still swirled, almost died following them. Would have, if you had not found me. She set down her coffee cup and looked at him directly. This is why I offer marriage. A man might help once from kindness, but only family bonds last through hard times. Elias couldn't help but chuckle, though there was little humor in it. Marriage ain't something to bargain with, girl. I am not girl, Nalan said sharply. I am woman of my people. I know what I offer. Her chin lifted proudly. I would be good wife. The earnestness in her voice made something twist in Elias's chest. He recognized the fear behind her offer, the distrust born from too many broken promises by white men. He'd seen enough treaties turn to ash to understand. Let me fetch you some extra blankets, he said gruffly, rising from the table. You'll need proper rest before we head out. Outside, the wind bit through his wool coat as he crossed to the storage shed. His mule button wickered a greeting from her shelter. Elias noticed a broken harness strap and grabbed his repair kit. Might as well fix it while thinking things through, as he worked the leather with cold, stiff fingers. His mind wandered to Sarah. 5 years gone, but sometimes he still reached for her in the night. The thought of taking another wife, especially one barely more than a girl, offering herself out of desperation, ... No. He'd helped Nalan find her sister because it was right, nothing more. The crunch of hooves in snow snapped his attention back to the present. 2 riders approached through the swirling flakes, one in a mining company coat, the other wearing a territorial marshal's badge that caught the morning light. Elias Keene, the marshal called out, reining his horse to a stop. Marshal Pike. Got some official business with you? The mining man dismounted with a swagger that set Elias's teeth on edge. A familiar scar crossed his left cheek. Garvey Foreman, he introduced himself, pulling papers from his coat. Got relocation orders for that Apache camp down in the valley. Here's their notice to clear out. Elias's hands stilled on the harness. Relocation orders. Whole valleys. Been claimed for mining operations, Foreman said, smirking. Governor himself signed off on it. They got 2 weeks to clear out. Then we start blasting. Marshal Pike cleared his throat. Got compensation. Arranged and everything. Compensation. Elias's voice was dangerously quiet. For their winter hunting grounds, their sacred springs, progress don't wait on superstition. Foreman sneered. You seen any Indians around here lately? Need to know if any of them need personal delivery of their notice? The casual threat in his tone made Elias's hand itch for his rifle. This wasn't just about one kidnapped girl. It was about driving an entire people from their land. The broken harness hung forgotten in his hands as he straightened to his full height. "Can't say as I have," he said evenly. "Storms kept folks close to home these past days." Marshal Pike nodded, looking uncomfortable. "Well, if you do see any, make sure they know. 2 weeks, then we start clearing the valley." He touched his hat brim. "Good day to you." As they rode away, Elias stood motionless in the snow, mind racing. The kidnapping, the relocation orders, it all connected. They meant to empty that valley one way or another, by force or by law. The question was, what could one mountain man do about it? Inside the cabin, Nayland stood at the window, her face tight with anger and fear. She'd heard everything. "Now you understand," she said quietly, "why I follow my sister's trail even in storm, why I offer a marriage price. They take our land, take our children, take everything." Elias met her gaze, seeing not a desperate girl, but a warrior fighting for her people's survival. The stakes had just grown far beyond a simple rescue mission. He'd walked away from injustice once when he left the army. This time would be different. "We'll find your sister," he said firmly, "and then we'll figure out how to stop them taking your land. No marriage price needed, you have my word." Nayland studied his face for a long moment. "Words are wind," she said finally. "We will see what your actions say." As the two riders turned their horses to leave, Elias called out, "Hold up a minute." He stepped forward, brushing snow from his beard. "Been meaning to ask about them. New stamp mills I heard were coming in. Might be looking for work come spring." Scarred face, twisted into something like a smile. "Always need good men, especially ones who know these mountains." He dismounted again, boots crunching in the fresh powder. "Pays fair, and there's bonus for those who understand how things need to be done." The cabin door banged open. Nayland strode out, bow in hand, her dark eyes blazing. "You have no right," she declared, arrow-nocked but pointed downward. "This land protected by treaty." Marshal Pike's hand dropped to his holster. "Now, Miz, don't do anything foolish." "Foolish is breaking sacred agreements," Nayland shot back. "Spring, near winter camp, belongs to my people. Has belonged since before your grandfather's grandfather was born." Foreman spat in the snow. "Treaties don't mean much when progress comes calling. Either clear out peaceful-like, or we'll have a company of soldiers up here to help you pack." "That a threat?" Elias asked quietly, his hand resting near his own. "Sidearm, just stating facts," Pike cut in, clearly wanting to defuse the situation. "Nobody wants bloodshed, but orders are orders. Orders based on lies." Nayland's voice carried sharp as an icicle on the winter wind. "Best keep your Indian woman in line." "Keen," Foreman sneered. "Hate to see anything unfortunate happen." He swung back into his saddle. 2 weeks, then we start blasting, whether the valley's clear or not." They watched the riders disappear into the swirling snow. Elias gently touched Nayland's bow arm. "Come inside. Need to look at those papers they left." By lamplight, Elias studied the documents spread across his table. The mining company's seal stood out bold at the bottom, along with a familiar signature. "Judge Harrison," he muttered, "known for taking bribes in Denver. Seen his handiwork before. What does paper say?" Nayland leaned close, though Elias knew she couldn't read the English words. "Says they're claiming the whole valley for mineral exploitation, including your winter camp and—" He paused. "Any water sources in the area." "The spring?" Nayland's fingers traced the edge of the paper. "Sacred to my people. Waters heal sick, make strong medicine. Grandfather says spirits blessed those waters before first white man ever saw. These mountains." Elias nodded slowly. "I've seen it. Clear as crystal, never freezes even in deepest winter." He met her eyes. "That kind of spring, ... miners would kill for it. Need water for their operations, and a spring that runs year-round, ... then we must stop them." Nayland's voice was firm. "First find my sister, then protect the spring. You will." "Help." Elias stood, moving to his storage chest. "We leave at first light." He began pulling out supplies, packages of smoked meat, extra ammunition for his Sharps rifle, 2 pairs of snowshoes. "Storm's easing, should be able to follow their trail, if we move quick." As night settled over the mountains, they sat before the fire. Nayland worked on restringing her bow, while Elias cleaned his rifle. The comfortable silence between them felt different now, weighted with shared purpose. My grandfather raised me after sickness, took my parents, Nayland said suddenly, testing the bow's draw. Taught me many things, but most important was truth. She relaxed the string, looking into the flames. Said man who lies to survive is already dead inside. Better to die speaking truth than live by lies. Elias set down his cleaning cloth. Wise man, your grandfather. What of your family? The question hung in the air like wood smoke. Elias hadn't spoken of Sarah to anyone in years, but something in Nayland's direct gaze made him want to honor her honesty with his own. Had a wife, Sarah. His voice was rough. Fever took her 5 years back. Was working as an army scout then, helping map the territories. He stared into the fire. Came home to find her burning up. Nothing the doctor could do. I am sorry, Nayland said simply. Loss leaves empty places in heart. That it does. Elias picked up his rifle again, but his hands were gentle on the worn stock. Left the army after seeing too many promises broken. Too many people pushed off their land. Couldn't be part of it anymore. Nayland nodded, understanding in her eyes. They worked in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Though neither spoke of it, something had shifted, a fragile trust beginning to form, like the first thin ice over a stream. But as Elias checked his supplies one final time, he felt the weight of what lay ahead. 2 people against a mining company, a corrupt judge, and possibly the army itself. The odds were long as winter shadows, and morning would come too soon. Dawn crept over the mountains in shades of steel and pearl. The sun, a pale disk, barely visible through scattered clouds. The temperature had dropped further overnight, making the air sharp enough to burn in their lungs. Outside Elias's cabin, frost sparkled on every surface, transforming ordinary branches into delicate crystal sculptures. Elias worked methodically, securing the leather straps of his snowshoes with fingers stiff from cold. The woven webbing would keep them from sinking too deep in the fresh powder. He'd done this countless times before, but today each motion felt weighted with urgency. Behind him, Nayland moved with quiet efficiency. Checking the mule's harness and adjusting the minimal supplies they'd packed. Animals seems to trust you, Elias observed, watching how the usually cantankerous mule stood calmly under her touch. Animals. No true heart, Nayland replied simply, patting the mule's frost-covered neck. She'd wrapped herself in one of Elias's spare wool blankets, wearing it like a shawl over her own clothes. The dark fabric made her look even younger, but her eyes remained sharp and focused. They set out as the morning light strengthened, following the deep ruts left by the freight wagon. The trail led down from Elias's cabin toward the valley, where the mining camps sprawled. Fresh snow had partially filled the tracks, but they remained visible enough to follow. The going was slow. Even with snowshoes, they had to pick their way carefully through drifts that sometimes reached past their knees. The wind cut across the open spaces between stands of pine, driving needles of ice into any exposed skin. Elias led the mule, while Nayland ranged slightly ahead, her eyes constantly scanning the landscape. By noon, the sun had done little to warm the day. Their breath still frosted in the air, and the wind showed no sign of letting up. Elias spotted a promising outcrop of red rock jutting from the snow-covered slope. Need to rest, he called to Nayland. Get some food in us. They huddled in the lee of the rock, sharing strips of dried venison and hard biscuits. The mule pawed at the snow, searching for any vegetation beneath. The brief shelter from the wind felt like luxury after hours of fighting it. Nayland suddenly went still, her head tilted. She rose in a fluid motion, moving to study the snow beyond their resting place. Here, she said, gesturing Elias over. 3 horses passed, and there she pointed to a wider depression partially filled with fresh snow, sled runners. Elias knelt to examine the signs. The tracks were perhaps a day old, heading southeast toward the railway spur that served the mining camps. He nodded. In confirmation, your sister must be. Nayland's face was tight with worry. They move fast, even in snow. They'll have to slow soon, Elias reassured her. Horses can't keep that pace in these conditions. They pressed on, following the tracks, until the short winter day began to fade. The wind had scoured some slopes, nearly bare of snow, while building deep drifts in the hollows, making their progress even more challenging. As dusk approached, Elias led them into a narrow draw where thick pines offered some protection from the relentless wind. We'll camp here, he announced, surveying the natural shelter. Any closer to the tracks, and we risk being spotted. Worked together to establish their small camp, gathering dead branches for a fire and clearing a space in the snow. The mule seemed grateful for the rest, immediately taking shelter behind a stand of pines. Once they had a small fire going, its light created a pocket of warmth in the gathering darkness. Nalin knelt beside the flames, her face solemn. She began to speak softly in Apache, her words carrying a rhythmic quality that made it clear she was praying. Elias stood quietly, head slightly bowed in respect. Though he couldn't understand the words, the reverence in her voice needed no translation. She was asking for guidance, for protection, for the strength to find her sister. When she finished, they sat in companionable silence, the fire crackling between them. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky when a chorus of yips and howls echoed through the draw. Nalin tensed, her hand moving toward her bow. "Just coyotes," Elias said softly. "They won't come near the fire. More scared of us than we are of them." Nalin relaxed slightly, but her eyes remained on the darkness beyond their circle of firelight. "In my people's stories, coyote is both trickster and teacher. Sometimes helps, sometimes brings trouble." The yipping grew closer, then faded again. As the pack moved on, in the quiet that followed, Nalin turned to look directly at Elias. "Do you truly believe we can succeed?" Her voice was low, but the question carried the weight of all her fears and hopes. Elias took his time answering, stoking the fire with a stick. When he spoke, his words were quiet but held absolute conviction. "If I didn't, I wouldn't be here." Nalin studied his face in the firelight, seeming to find something there that satisfied her. She nodded once, then wrapped herself in her blanket and settled close to the fire. "We should rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." Elias took first watch, his rifle across his knees, listening to the wind in the pines and the occasional distant cry of a coyote. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and bright against the black sky. While the fire slowly burned down to glowing coals, by mid-morning weak sunlight filtered through thinning clouds. Elias and Nalin crested a snow-covered ridge, their breath coming in sharp bursts in the thin mountain air. Below them, the valley spread out like a weathered blanket, patched with dark stands of pine and white meadows. A thin column of dark smoke rose from somewhere near the valley floor, moving against the pale sky. "Steam engine," Elias said, pointing. "To the smoke plume, rail line runs through there, connects to the mining camps." Nalin shielded her eyes against the glare of snow. How far? 4, maybe 5 miles. Rough going, though. The descent proved him right. The slope pitched steeply, forcing them to zigzag back and forth across its face. The mule, usually sure-footed, struggled with the terrain. Twice, the animal's hooves slipped on ice hidden beneath the snow, nearly sending their supplies tumbling. Each time, Elias managed to steady the beast, speaking low and calm until it settled. "Easy now," he murmured, stroking the mule's neck after the second near fall. "Ain't no rush worth broken legs." Nalin watched from a few paces ahead, her face tight with barely contained impatience. But she said nothing, understanding that haste now could cost them dearly. By early afternoon, they reached the valley floor, where a creek cut through the snow. Ice rimmed its edges, but the center still flowed, dark water moving silent beneath a partially frozen surface. Nalin moved ahead, scanning the banks with practiced eyes. Suddenly, she stopped. There, she pointed to a bare willow branch hanging. Over the water, something blue fluttered from its twigs like a tiny flag. Elias helped her reach it. A scrap of fabric no bigger than his palm, faded blue cotton, snagged on the rough bark. Nalin's hands trembled slightly as she held it. "This is a yokas," she said softly. "From her dress, our grandmother made it last summer." Her fingers traced the simple pattern woven into the cloth. "Recent?" Elias asked, examining the branch. "Yes, no ice formed over it." Nalin tucked the scrap carefully into her pocket. "They passed here, maybe yesterday." They followed the creek downstream, using its course as a guide. The water would lead them toward the rail line, and the easier terrain meant they could move faster, but nature had other plans. The first signs came, as a darkening of the western sky, clouds building thick and heavy over the peaks. The wind shifted, carrying the sharp smell of approaching snow. Elias watched the sky with growing concern. "Blizzard coming," he said finally. "Coming fast. We cannot stop." Nayland protested, but already the wind was rising, driving ice crystals against their faces. "Won't do your sister any good if we freeze to death." Elias scanned the creek banks. "Need shelter. Now." They found it just as the storm hit in earnest, a shallow cave carved into a rock face by centuries of spring floods. It wasn't deep, maybe 12 feet at most, but its mouth faced away from the wind, and it was dry inside. They got the mule, and just as the world disappeared behind a curtain of white, the storm transformed the afternoon into twilight. Wind howled against the rocks, driving snow into drifts that grew by the minute. Inside the cave, Elias worked quickly to gather what dry wood he could find near the entrance. Soon, a small fire cast dancing shadows on the rock walls. They sat close to the flames, sharing the last of the morning's jerky. The mule stood at the back of the cave, occasionally stamping its feet, but otherwise content to be out of the weather. Outside, the storm raged on. Nayland's eyes kept drifting to the Sharp's rifle propped against the cave wall near Elias. Finally, she asked, "That rifle you carry at long time?" Elias nodded, reaching over to run his hand along the worn stock. "Since my army days, served me well then, serves me well now." "You were soldier." There was a new wariness in her voice. "Was scout, mostly, working with the cavalry." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks upward. Left after seeing too many. Promises broken, treaties made, treaties ignored, couldn't stomach it anymore. Nayland studied him in the firelight, her dark eyes thoughtful. "Many soldiers, they say pretty words, but hearts are empty." "You," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "You speak. Little, but words have weight." "Reckon that's so." Elias added another stick to the fire. "Learned young that actions speak clearer than promises. Man's word should mean something." The storm showed no signs of letting up as night fell. Wind screamed through the rocks outside, but their small cave remained relatively warm. Protected from the worst of the weather, the fire needed constant feeding with their limited wood supply, but it held back both the cold and the darkness. Nal wrapped herself in her blanket, sitting cross-legged near the flames. "Storm spirits are angry tonight," she said softly. "Seems that way." Elias leaned back against the cave wall, keeping his rifle close. No moving until it passes. Best get some rest while we can. Through the long night, the blizzard raged against the mountains. Snow piled deeper outside their shelter, wind howling like a living thing as it tore through the valley. Inside their cave, they took turns keeping the fire alive, each lost in their own thoughts as they waited for dawn. The mule dozed, standing up, occasionally twitching its ears at particularly loud gusts. Nayland slept fitfully, murmuring her sister's name in her dreams. Elias kept watch, his weathered face illuminated by the dancing flames. As the storm voiced its fury against the unyielding stone, morning light crept into their shelter, revealing the storm's passing. The wind had died to whispers, and the heavy clouds dissolved into tatters of pale gray. Outside the cave, the world lay buried under fresh snow, pristine and silent. Elias stood at the cave mouth, studying the transformed landscape. Storms broke. Time to move. They dug the mule out of a drift that had formed across the cave entrance and repacked their gear with cold-stiffened fingers. The sun climbed higher as they pushed through deep snow, following the creek's course. Toward the railroad, by midday, smoke from multiple cook fires rose ahead of them, marking the railside camp. They paused behind a screen of pine trees, watching men move between canvas tents and stacks of mining equipment. The camp sprawled along the tracks, a temporary town of canvas and wooden crates dusted with fresh snow. "Too many eyes," Nayland whispered. Counting the workers, Elias nodded, then shrugged off his heavy wool coat. "Here, put this on." Nayland eyed the coat uncertainly. "Cover your clothes," Elias explained. "From a distance, they'll see what they expect to see, just another worker." The coat swallowed her small frame, falling nearly to her knees. She rolled the sleeves back and pulled up the collar, hiding her face in its shadow. Elias nodded approval. They left the mule tied in the trees and approached the camp from its busiest side. Where loading crews worked around stacked freight, Elias walked slightly ahead, his stance casual but alert. Followed, matching his unhurried pace, They wound between towers of wooden crates marked with shipping stamps. The smell of coffee and wood smoke drifted from the mess tent, along with the clatter of tin plates and fragments of rough conversation. A few men glanced their way, but quickly returned to their work. Near the mess tent, an old man stood stirring a huge pot of beans over a cook fire. His back was bent like a windswept tree, and his beard showed more gray than brown. As they passed, his rheumy eyes fixed on Elias with a flash of recognition. "Well, if it ain't the mountain man," the cook said softly, careful not to draw attention. "Been what?" "3 winters since you hauled supplies through here." Elias paused, keeping his voice equally low. "Didn't expect you'd remember, Mr. Jenkins. Remember most folks who pay their bills proper?" Jenkins stirred his pot, eyes scanning. "The camp," as he spoke. "Reckon you ain't here for supplies this time, though. Looking for someone young girl, bride in recent." Jenkins nodded slightly. "Figured as much, when I saw your companion there." He gestured with his spoon toward a large tent near the tracks. "They got her in there. 2 guards, but they ain't much for staying sober past sundown." "Much obliged," Elias murmured. "Come sunset, I'll start up a friendly game in the mess tent. Cards and whiskey usually draw a crowd." Jenkins turned back to his cooking. "Might make things quieter elsewhere, if you take my meaning," they found. Shelter behind a loaded coal car, settling in to wait as afternoon light faded from the sky. Jenkins brought them a tin of beans, muttering that nobody would miss it from the evening meal. They shared the food in whispers, watching shadows lengthen. "Across the snow, why does he help?" Nayland asked softly. "Some men still know right from wrong," Elias replied. Even out here, they planned in low voices as the camp settled into evening routines. Lamps flickered to life in tent after tent. The smell of tobacco smoke mixed with the sharp mountain air. From their hiding place, they could see 2 miners standing guard outside the freight tent, passing a bottle between them as darkness gathered. Jenkins's voice rang out from the mess tent, calling men to a poker game. The prospect of cards and drinking drew a steady stream of workers, including the 2 guards. Soon, loud laughter and the clink of coins drifted through the canvas walls. Now, Elias breathed. They crept from behind the coal car, moving silent. As shadows across the trampled snow, at the freight tent's rear, Elias drew his knife and carefully sliced an opening in the canvas. He slipped inside, Nayland close behind. Oil lamps hanging from the tent poles cast yellow light over stacked crates and bundles of railroad spikes. In the corner, a girl lay curled on a pile of empty grain sacks. Her dark hair fell forward, hiding. Her face, but bruises, showed on her arms where her sleeves had been torn. "Ayoka!" She reached for her sister with trembling hands. Elias kept watch at the tent's entrance while the sisters embraced, their whispered words too soft to hear. When he glanced back, he saw tears on both their faces. But Ayoka was already struggling to her feet, ready to move. From the mess tent came a burst of laughter and the sound of Jenkins's voice raised in song, covering any noise of their escape. The night waited dark and deep beyond the camp's boundaries, promising shelter in its shadows. Elias pulled his hunting knife from its leather sheath, the blade gleaming dully in the tent's dim light. He worked quickly to cut through the rope binding Ayoka's wrists, careful not to nick her skin. The rough hemp fibers parted with soft scratching sounds, falling away to reveal angry red marks where the bonds had dug deep. Ayoka stumbled into her sister's arms, her whole body trembling. Nayland held her close, whispering soft words in Apache while stroking her tangled hair. The sisters clung to each other, their shadows merging on the canvas wall behind them. "We need to move," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. He gestured toward the slit he'd cut in the tent's back wall. Now, while the camp's distracted, through the gap in the canvas, cold air rushed in, carrying the distant sounds of the poker game. Jenkins's gravelly voice rose above the others. Leading the men in a bawdy mining song, the old cook was doing his part to keep attention away from their escape. Elias went first, parting the canvas and scanning the darkness beyond. The night air, bit sharp and clean after the stuffy tent, snow had begun falling again, lazy flakes drifting down from an ink-black sky. He motioned the sisters through, then followed, letting the canvas fall closed behind them. They crept between shadows of freight cars and stacked lumber. Elias leading the way with practiced stealth, Ayoka moved slowly, stiff from days of being bound. Naylin supported her sister with an arm around her waist, helping her through the deeper drifts. The tree line waited ahead, dark pines reaching toward the starless sky. They had covered perhaps half the distance when a beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the snow. Ilyas's hand shot up in warning, and they froze mid-step. Heavy boots crunched in the snow, coming closer. One of the guards had left the poker game early, swaying slightly as he walked his patrol route. The lantern in his hand cast wild shadows as he stumbled through the fresh powder. Ilyas pressed back against a stack of crates, motioning the sisters to stay absolutely still. The guard passed within 10 feet of their position, close enough that they could smell the whiskey on his breath. He paused, lifting the lantern higher, its light sliding across the snow toward their hiding place. In one fluid motion, Ilyas stepped out from behind the crates. Before the guard could shout, the rifle but struck him just behind the ear with a dull thud. The man crumpled without a sound, his lantern falling into a snowbank where its flame sputtered and died. "Run," Ilyas commanded, his voice urgent but controlled. They sprinted for the trees, no longer trying to move quietly. Snow squeaked beneath their boots, and their breath came in white puffs in the freezing air. Behind them, the camp remained quiet, except for the continued sounds of revelry from the mess tent. They found the mule where they'd left it, stamping its hooves against the cold. Ilyas helped Ayoka onto the sled, wrapping her in the blankets. Naylin climbed up beside her sister Bo at the ready, while Ilyas took the mule's lead rope. They pushed deep into the forest, the mule straining against the sled's weight in the fresh snow. Light flakes continued to fall gradually, filling their tracks, nature herself helping to mask their escape. The darkness wrapped around them like a cloak, broken only by occasional glimpses of gray clouds between the pine boughs overhead. After several hours of hard travel, well past midnight, Ilyas spotted a darker shape among the trees. An abandoned line shack emerged from the gloom, its log walls weathered gray with age. A sagging roof still held most of its shingles, promising shelter from the wind and snow. Inside, the air hung stale and cold. Ilyas worked quickly to clear the small stone fireplace, while Naylin helped Ayoka settle onto the rough plank floor. Soon, a small fire crackled in the hearth, casting welcome warmth and light through the single room. The sisters huddled together. Under the blankets, Ayoka still trembling despite the growing warmth, Naylin held her close, murmuring soft words of comfort. In the firelight, the bruises on Ayoka's face showed stark against her pale skin, but her eyes had lost their haunted look, replaced by exhausted relief. "Try to rest," Ilyas told them, checking his rifle's action. "I'll keep watch outside." He stepped out into the night, closing the door quietly behind him. The snow had nearly stopped, leaving the forest draped in pristine white. From his position beside the shack, he had a clear view of the ridge they'd descended. He searched the darkness for any sign of lantern light that would betray pursuers, but saw only stars beginning to peek through breaks in the clouds inside the shack. He could hear the soft sounds of the sisters' breathing, punctuated by an occasional pop from the fire. After days of fear and cold pursuit, that simple sound felt like a miracle, proof of life and hope preserved against long odds. Ilyas settled in for his vigil, rifle across his knees, while the night deepened around them. The wind whispered through pine needles overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a lone owl called into the darkness. For now, at least, they were safe. Morning sunlight crept through gaps in the shack's weathered walls, painting thin golden lines across the plank floor. The scent of coffee mingled with wood smoke as Ilyas stirred the precious grounds into his dented pot, watching the water darken. His supply was getting low, just enough for maybe 2 more days. Still, after the night they'd had, they all needed something warm to start the day. Near the dying fire, Naylin dabbed at her sister's face with a cloth dampened from melted snow. Ayoka winced as the fabric touched a purple bruise along her jaw, but didn't pull away. The younger girl's eyes were clearer this morning, though shadows of fear still lingered in their depths. "The spring herbs would help these heal faster," Naylin said softly, examining a cut above Ayoka's eyebrow. "We should head straight to the camp. Grandfather will know what to do." Ilyas poured the coffee into 3 tin cups, the steam rising in lazy spirals. Taking the direct route would be dangerous. "The mining road runs right between here and your camp." He passed them each a cup, his movements careful and measured. Those men will be looking for us, and they'll watch the obvious paths. Nalen's fingers tightened around her cup. But Ayoka needs rest, proper food. We can't keep running through the woods forever. We won't have to. Ilias moved to the window, scanning the quiet forest beyond. Fresh snow blanketed everything, pristine, except for a few deer tracks. If we circle wide through the high country, we can come at the camp from the west. It'll take longer, but he broke off, head tilting. In the distance, the hollow thud of hoofbeats echoed through the trees. Elias pressed closer to the window, breath fogging the grimy glass. Through gaps in the pines, he caught flashes of movement riders, at least 6 of them, with the foreman's distinctive black hat visible at the lead. Out now. His voice was low but urgent. Through the back, stay low and head for the trees. The sisters scrambled to their feet. Nayland helped Ayoka up, supporting her as they moved toward the rear door. Elias grabbed his rifle and the blankets, then doused the fire with snow. The coffee cups sat abandoned. Still steaming on the floor, they slipped out the back of the shack into the biting morning air. The snow was deep here, reaching past their ankles as they pushed toward the tree line. Ayoka stumbled, weak from her ordeal, and Nayland struggled to keep her sister upright before they could reach the shelter of the pines. Riders burst from the woods on both sides. The thunder of hooves on packed snow filled the air as the men circled around, cutting off their escape. The foreman's face was red with cold and anger as he leveled a revolver at them. "That's far enough. Keen," he shouted. "Drop the rifle." 2. Riders drove their horses straight at Elias. He tried to bring the sharps up, but a rifle butt caught him across the shoulders from behind. He fell hard to his knees in the snow, the weapon kicked away from his reaching hands. Rough hands grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back. No. Ayoka's scream pierced the morning as one of the men dragged her toward his horse. She fought like a wild thing, kicking and clawing, but exhaustion had left her too weak. The rider hauled her up across his saddle horn like a sack of grain, lunged toward her sister, but strong arms caught her around the waist. She thrashed against the hold, her voice breaking. "Ayoka, let her go." The foreman wheeled his horse closer, snow spraying from its hooves. His smile was cold as he looked down at Elias. "You're more trouble than you're worth, mountain man. Time you learned what happens to folks who meddle in company business." He turned to his men. "Torch it." 2 riders dismounted, pulling oil-soaked rags from their saddlebags. They stuffed the burning cloth through gaps in the shack's walls and under the door. Flames licked up the dry wood almost instantly. Hungry after years of mountain winters, Elias struggled against the men holding him, but a fist drove into his ribs, stealing his breath. He could only watch as smoke began to pour from the roof, dark against the pale morning sky. The heat of the fire reached them even yards away, the crackling of burning timber like mocking laughter. "Let's move," the foreman ordered. "Get the girl back to camp." And if these 2 tried to follow, he left the threat hanging as he spurred his horse toward the mining road. The men holding Nayland shoved her roughly away. She fell to her knees beside Elias in the trampled snow, reaching helplessly toward the riders as they thundered away. Ayoka's cries grew fainter. Swallowed by the sound of pounding hooves and the roar of the burning shack, Elias pushed himself up, ribs screaming in protest. Behind them, their shelter was fully engulfed, flames reaching toward the crystal blue sky. Black smoke poured from every opening, carrying with it the scent of coffee and safety turned to ash. The heat drove them further back as burning shingles began to fall. They stood together in the snow, watching their brief victory crumble into flames. Nayland's hands were clenched into fists at her sides, her face wet with tears of rage and despair. The fire reflected in her eyes as their shelter collapsed in on itself, sending a shower of sparks spiraling up into the winter morning. The sound of the riders had faded completely now, leaving only the crack and roar of the burning shack. They had found warmth and hope just hours before. Now only destruction remained. The flames would burn until they ran out of fuel, leaving nothing but charred logs and bitter memories in the pristine snow. The forest shadows lengthened as Elias and Nayland pushed through knee-deep snow. Each step sent waves of pain through Ilias's bruised ribs, but he kept moving, using his rifle as a walking stick. Behind them, a thin column of smoke still rose from the remains of the line shack, marking their failure like a dark finger against the steel-gray sky. Nayland walked beside him in silence, her borrowed coat pulled tight against the growing cold. The tracks of the foreman's men had long since disappeared under fresh snowfall, but her eyes kept scanning the white expanse ahead as if she might catch some glimpse of her sister through the trees. "There's an old trapper's cabin about a mile ahead," Elias said, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "Built into a hillside, hard to spot unless you know where to look. We can rest there, get warm." Nayland didn't respond, just trudged forward through the deepening dusk. The wind picked up rattling pine branches overhead and sending loose snow, swirling around their feet. By the time they reached the cabin, the first stars were appearing in breaks. Between the clouds, the cabin was little more than a three-sided lean-to with a low roof, but its back wall was solid rock and thick pine. Boughs still covered most of the top. Elias cleared away snow from the entrance, while Nayland gathered dry kindling from beneath nearby evergreens. Soon a small fire crackled in the stone hearth, filling the space with welcome warmth and the sharp scent of pine smoke. They huddled close to the flames, sharing the last of their jerky. Elias winced as he shifted position, his ribs protesting every movement. The firelight carved deep shadows across Nayland's face as she stared into the flames, her expression hard and distant. "So, this is it," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We just give up. Let them take everything." Elias poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing upward. Fighting back now would be suicide. "Those men won't hesitate to kill us both, and then what good would we be to your sister, to your people? At least we would have tried." Nayland's words cracked like dry branches in the quiet cabin. "My grandfather taught me that some things are worth dying for. Our sacred places, our children's future." She turned to face him fully, eyes bright with fury. But maybe that means nothing to someone who walks away when things get difficult. The accusation hit harder than any of the foreman's blows. Elias felt the old shame rise up, memories of other injustices he'd witnessed, other times he'd chosen, survival over standing his ground. The fire popped and hissed in the silence between them. "Get some rest," he said finally, his voice rough. "I'll keep watch." Nayland wrapped herself in one of their remaining blankets and lay down with her back to him, her body rigid with anger. The night deepened outside their shelter, snow beginning to fall again in lazy spirals past the entrance. Elias sat awake, listening to the soft tick of snowflakes against pine needles and the quiet rhythm of Nayland's breathing as she eventually drifted into exhausted sleep. His ribs ached in time, with his heartbeat as he watched the fire slowly die down to glowing coals. Nayland's words echoed in his mind, mixing with older voices, his wife's gentle wisdom, his sergeant's harsh lessons about duty, an Apache elder he'd once shared coffee with who spoke of sacred trust between people and land, seemed to ask the same question: when did surviving become more important than living right? The answer came to him as false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. He stirred the coals back to life, adding small sticks until flames danced again. Nayland woke at his movement, sitting up with the blanket pulled around her shoulders. "I know someone," Elias said before she could speak. "A retired cavalry chaplain living in the valley north of here, Matthew Crane. He used to serve at the fort." "Near your reservation." Nayland's eyes narrowed. "Why would a soldier help us? Why would a soldier help us?" "Because he left the army for the same reason I did. Too many broken promises, too many treaties ignored." Elias fed another stick to the fire. "More importantly, he knows treaty law better than any man I've met. If there's a legal way to stop this land grab, he'll know it. And if there isn't," Nayland's voice was quiet but intense. "What then?" Elias met her gaze across the flames. "Then we'll know we tried everything before choosing a harder path." He watched understanding dawn in her eyes. "Either way, I won't walk away this time. You have my word." The sun rose fully as they shared this moment of silent agreement, painting the snow-covered forest in shades of rose and gold. Outside their shelter, a fresh blanket of white covered their tracks from the night before. Offering a clean slate for the day ahead, the smell of pine smoke filled the air between them, no longer bitter with defeat, but carrying something new. The sharp, clear scent of purpose, the journey to Chaplain Crane's homestead, tested their endurance. 2 days of bitter travel through deep snow left them exhausted, their supplies dwindling to mere crumbs of jerky and the last handful of coffee beans. They slept in the lee of rock formations and under dense evergreen branches, sharing what warmth they could find, near sunset on the second day. Smoke from a cabin chimney beckoned them through the trees. The chaplain's homestead sat nestled against a hillside, weathered logs glowing golden in the fading light. A mule dozed in a sheltered pen, and split firewood was stacked neatly against the cabin wall. Chaplain Matthew Crane met them at the door, his silver hair and beard neatly trimmed. Despite his frontier home, his eyes lit with recognition as Elias stepped into the lamplight. "Elias Keene," the chaplain said warmly, clasping Elias's arm. "Last time I saw you, you were scouting for the 5th Cavalry." He ushered them inside, where a pot of beans simmered. "On the wood stove, you left not long after I did, as I recall." "Similar reasons," Elias said, helping Nylon remove her snow-crusted coat. Over bowls of hot beans and fresh cornbread, they shared their story. The chaplain listened intently, his weathered face growing grave as they described the mining companies, threats, and Ayoka's capture. When they finished, he rose without a word and retrieved a leather-bound book from a trunk near his bed. "I kept copies of every treaty I witnessed," he said, carefully turning brittle pages, including this one. His finger traced down a column of formal text, then stopped. "Here, this clause specifically protects both the spring and the winter campgrounds as sacred sites. The mining company can't legally touch either one." Nayland leaned forward, hope kindling in her eyes. "Will this be enough to stop them?" "With witnesses present, it could be," the chaplain said. "The company won't want their illegal actions exposed. I know 2 ranch families who would stand with us, the Hendersons and the Wilsons. They owe Elias for helping find their strayed cattle last winter." 3 days, Elias said, studying the treaty page. "We can gather everyone at the spring by then, make them face what they're doing in front of witnesses who matter in the territory." The chaplain nodded. "I'll ride out tomorrow." To rally the ranchers. "They're good people. They won't stand for this kind of thievery." Later that night, after the chaplain had retired to his bed, Nayland and Elias sat by the dying fire. The cabin was quiet, except for the soft pop of embers and the wind's low moan outside. "Thank you," Nayland said softly, her eyes on the flames. "For not giving up, for finding a way." Elias looked at her profile in the firelight, seeing strength and grace where he'd once seen only desperate determination. "You did that," he said. "Made me believe some things deserve a second chance. Some fights are worth the risk." She turned to meet his gaze, a small smile touching her lips. In that moment, the warmth between them had nothing to do with the fire. Morning sun cast long shadows as their small group wound through the snow-dusted foothills. Chaplain Crane led the way on his sturdy bay horse, while Elias and Nayland followed with their mule-drawn sled. The terrain rolled beneath pewter skies, each hill revealing another beyond it. Near midday, they heard voices calling from a side trail. 2 men emerged from a stand of pine, rifles slung across their backs. Elias's hand moved to his sharps, but the chaplain raised a peaceful hand. Thomas Burke and Will Morton, Chaplain Crane called out, "Former rail workers, if I'm not mistaken." Taller man, Burke nodded. "Left Garvey's crew last month. Couldn't stomach how he treated folks." He glanced at Nayland, especially the natives whose land he's stealing. Morton, stockier and graying at the temples, stepped forward. "Heard through the chaplain what you're aiming to do. Thought you might. Need extra rifles on your side?" Their group grew stronger, 6 people now, moving together through the wilderness. The added firearms brought comfort, but it was the miners' knowledge of Garvey's operation that proved most valuable. Around the evening fire, they shared details of the company's weak points and corrupt dealings. That first night, stars pierced the dark like ice crystals. Nayland taught them Apache words, "Itid lot," for respect, "Daddy-ch," "Xx," for sharing. Stories. The miners listened intently, repeating the sounds until they got them right. In return, they spoke of years working the rails, tales of lost friends, of accidents covered up by the company, of small kindnesses that made the work bearable. The next day brought harder travel. The terrain grew rougher, forcing them to pick careful paths between rock outcrops. Their progress slowed, but no one complained. They'd become something more than strangers, sharing a journey. They were bound now by purpose and growing trust. The second night found them camped in a protected hollow. After the others had settled in, Nayland drew Elias aside. They walked a short distance from the fire, their boots crunching in the snow. Above them, the stars wheeled in silent brilliance. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "about what I said. When we first met, about giving you sons in exchange for help." She turned to face him, her eyes reflecting starlight. "I don't see it that way anymore. I believe the spirits guided me to your cabin that day. We were meant to meet," Elias felt, his heart stir at her words. The fierce young woman who had collapsed at his feet, offering herself as payment, had become someone who moved his soul in ways he hadn't thought possible. But the timing wasn't right for such revelations. He remained silent, though his eyes held hers a moment longer than necessary before they returned to the warmth of the fire and their waiting companions together. Their small band represented a unity that transcended their different backgrounds: Apache wisdom, frontier justice, working men's honor, and a shared belief in doing what was right. As they settled in for the night, the spring awaited them, and with it, the chance to make their stand. Dawn painted the mountains gold as their group crested the final ridge. Below, the sacred spring nestled in a natural bowl of granite, its waters impossibly clear despite the rim of winter ice. Steam rose in delicate wisps, dancing against the cold morning air. The sight stopped them all in their tracks, even those who had seen it before. There, Nayland breathed, pointing to movement near the water. "My people are already here." Multiple cook fires dotted the area around the spring, their smoke rising straight up in the still air. Apache families had set up their winter lodges in a protective half-circle around the water. Beyond them, 2 groups of canvas tents marked where the ranch families had made camp. Elias led their party down the slope, the mule picking its way carefully through patches of snow and stone. As they approached, a tall Apache man strode forward, his face creasing with relief when he spotted Nayland. "Uncle Nayland," called out, sliding from her horse and running to embrace him. The man wrapped her in his arms, then looked over her shoulder at Elias with eyes that had seen many winters. "You protected my sister's daughter," he said, his voice deep and measured. "We heard of your help from others who passed through." "Thank you," Elias nodded, uncomfortable with praise. "The chaplain here found something that might help us all." He gestured to Crane, who produced the leather-bound treaty from his saddlebag. Before they could discuss further, a young Apache boy came running from his lookout position on a nearby rise. "Riders coming," he shouted in his own language, which Nayland translated quickly. "Many men with pack mules carrying wooden boxes." "Dynamite," Morton said grimly, recognizing the description from his mining days. "Garvey means to blast if he cannot bully." Elias checked his Sharp's rifle, but kept it pointed down. "Remember what we discussed?" he called out to their assembled group. "The treaty is our shield today, not bullets. We show them the law first." The chaplain straightened his coat and moved to stand before the spring, the treaty held open in his weathered hands. Ranch families and Apache alike formed a line behind him, presenting a united front. Steam continued to rise from the sacred waters, as if the spring itself breathed in anticipation. Nayland took her place beside Elias, her bow unstrung but close at hand. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "we face it together." The sound of approaching hooves grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of tack and the creak of laden mules. Their defenders stood firm, watching the trail that wound up from the mining road. The morning sun climbed higher, glinting off the spring's surface and the ice that rimmed its edges. The chaplain's voice carried clearly in the crisp air as he held the treaty higher. "Stand ready, Ferns, but let justice speak first." The foreman's party emerged from the trail. Garvey Foreman led the column, his face twisted in a sneer as he counted the defenders. Behind him rode 12 men, rifles across their saddles, and the territorial marshal brought up the rear with a bored expression. "Clear out," Foreman bellowed. "This land's been claimed for mining." Elias stepped forward, boots crunching in the snow. "Marshal Pike, as a lawman, you're duty-bound to hear this." He gestured to the chaplain, who held out the treaty. "Read it out loud, if you please." The marshal's horse shifted beneath him as he took the document. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the page, then widened slightly. Clearing his throat, he began to read. "The sacred spring and winter campgrounds, as marked on the accompanying map, shall remain under the sole protection and use of the Western Apache people in perpetuity." A murmur rippled through both sides. One of the ranch wives nodded firmly. "We'll all testify if that paper's ignored," she called out. "Every one of us." "Same here," added Morton, the former miner. "We'll tell every newspaper from here to Denver how the law was broken." Foreman's face reddened as he looked from face to face, finding no allies. His hand tightened on his reins until his knuckles went white. Finally, he spat into the snow. "Release the girl," he growled to his men. "We're done here." Ayoka stumbled forward as they cut her bonds. She ran straight to Nayland, the sisters collapsing into each other's arms as tears flowed freely. Around them, cheers erupted from both settlers and Apache alike. The foreman wheeled his horse around and spurred it hard, his men following in a cloud of kicked-up snow. The sacred spring burbled peacefully, its waters still untouched, still free. The March sun warmed the little church's weathered boards as people filed inside. Through the windows, melting snow dripped steadily from the eaves, marking winter's slow retreat. Inside, settlers in their Sunday best sat shoulder-to-shoulder with Apache families in traditional dress, while reformed miners shuffled their feet. Near the back pews, Chaplain Crane stood at the front, his Bible opened in his weathered hands, his eyes twinkling as Elias shifted nervously in his clean shirt. When Nayland appeared in the doorway, a collective breath was drawn. She wore a dress of white cotton, adorned with intricate beadwork that Ayoka had helped her create. Her dark hair fell in 2 long braids, woven with strips of white leather. Walked beside her sister, carrying a small bundle of early spring wildflowers. Her shy smile lit up her face as she watched Nayland and Elias join hands before the chaplain. Love, like the sacred spring, flows pure and true. Chaplain Crane's warm voice filled the church. It brings life to barren places and healing to wounded hearts. After the simple ceremony, everyone gathered outside, where tables groaned under the weight of food. Steam rose from huge pots of venison stew, while Apache women passed around platters of fresh fry bread. Coffee flowed freely as stories and laughter mixed with the crisp mountain air. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Elias hitched up his mule to the supply sled. This time, Nayland climbed up beside him, her hand finding his. Ayoka settled in the back among the boxes and blankets, her giggle joining the bright music of harness bells. They set off toward home, the great peaks rising around them like ancient guardians. The mountains that had once seemed so lonely to Elias now stood as silent witnesses to their joy, protecting the path that had brought them together. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to subscribe. I post daily, and the next story might be exactly what you need to hear.